In the summer of 1914, the city of London was not just the capital of the British Empire, it was the capital of the world. It was the center of gravity for global finance, the clearinghouse for international trade, and the vault where the world kept its savings. The British pound sterling was the only currency that mattered. It was as good as gold, literally, because under the gold standard, you could walk into the Bank of England and exchange your paper notes for shining yellow sovereigns. At that moment, Britain was the world's greatest creditor nation. It owned railways and Argentina mines in South Africa, tea plantations in India, and vast industrial concerns in the United States. It seemed unimaginable that this titan of wealth could ever be brought to its knees, let alone become a debtor begging for cash. But within 3 years of the first shot being fired in World War I, the unimaginable had become reality. The story of how Britain lost its financial crown is not a story of battlefield defeats or naval disasters. It is a story of how the cost of modern industrial warfare burned through 3 centuries of accumulated wealth in a matter of months. It is the story of how power migrated across the Atlantic Ocean from the old banks of London to the new skyscrapers of New York. And it is the story of the moment the United States realized it could buy an empire for the price of a loan. When the war began in August 1914, the British government and the British public suffered from a collective delusion. They believed the war would be short. The slogan was over by Christmas. This belief was not just born of optimism, it was born of financial necessity. The economists in London calculated that a general European war would be so expensive, so devastating to trade, and credit that the global economy would collapse within 6 months, forcing everyone to the peace table. They were wrong. The economy did not collapse. Instead, it transformed into a monster that consumed money at a rate that defied all historical precedent. The first shock came within days. As the armies mobilized, the global financial system froze. The London Stock Exchange closed its doors for 5 months, the longest closure in its history. But the British government remained confident. They believed they could finance the war the way they had financed the wars against Napoleon a century earlier. They would use their massive gold reserves and their tax revenue to pay for the army, and they would subsidize their allies France and Russia, who were less wealthy. Britain would be the bank of the Allied war effort. But this war was different. It was the first total war of the industrial age. It was not fought just with men and muskets. It was fought with millions of artillery shells, thousands of machine guns, miles of barbed wire, and oceans of oil. And crucially, Britain did not produce enough of these things domestically. To fight Germany, Britain needed to turn its economy into a war machine, but it also needed to import massive amounts of raw materials and finished goods. And there was only one country on Earth with the industrial capacity and the natural resources to supply the Allies on such a massive scale: the United States of America. In 1914, the United States was still a sleeping giant. It was an economic powerhouse, but it was politically isolationist and militarily small. It was also a debtor nation. American industries had been built largely with British capital. British investors owned billions of dollars worth of American railroad stocks and bonds. The flow of dividends usually went from New York to London. But as the British War Ministry began placing orders for steel, wheat, copper, and explosives, the flow of money began to reverse. At first, the British paid for these American goods with their cash reserves. They shipped gold across the Atlantic. But the scale of the purchasing was so vast that the gold reserves began to dwindle alarmingly fast. A single day of shelling on the Western Front could cost millions of pounds. By 1915, the British government realized they had a problem. They were running out of liquid cash to pay the Americans. To solve this liquidity crisis, the British government turned to the most powerful banker in America, John Pierpont Morgan Jr., known as Jack Morgan. His father had built the House of Morgan into a financial empire that rivaled nations. Jack Morgan was a staunch Anglophile. He loved Britain. He hated the Germans. And he saw an opportunity to make the House of Morgan the most important financial institution in the world. In January 1915, the British government signed a secret agreement with J.P. Morgan and Company. They appointed the bank as their sole purchasing agent in the United States. This meant that if the British Army needed 1 million rifles or 5 million cans of beef, they wouldn't go to the manufacturers directly. They would tell Morgan, and Morgan would buy it for them. In return, Morgan would get a commission on every single item bought. It was the deal of the century. The House of Morgan became the de facto supply department of the British Empire. Through the offices of J.P. Morgan at 23, Wall Street, billions of dollars of contracts flowed. The American economy, which had been in a recession in 1914, suddenly exploded into a boom. Factories in the Midwest ran 24 hours a day to fill British orders. Farmers on the Great Plains expanded their fields to feed British soldiers. The United States was becoming rich on the war, but Britain was becoming poor. By late 1915, the cash crisis returned with a vengeance. The gold shipments were not enough. The British government had to find a new way to pay. They decided to tap into the private wealth of their citizens. The British Treasury issued a call for patriots to sell their American securities to the government. They wanted British citizens who owned shares in companies like U.S. Steel or the Pennsylvania Railroad to hand those shares over to the British government. The government would pay the citizens in pounds in London and then sell the shares in New York for dollars to pay for the war. It was a soft confiscation of wealth. The government was liquidating the nation's investment portfolio to buy bullets. It was like a family selling their house and their car to pay a gambling debt. They were burning the furniture to keep the house warm. But even this massive liquidation wasn't enough. The appetite of the war was insatiable. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 consumed ammunition faster than it could be manufactured or paid for. The British government realized they needed to borrow. They needed to take out loans in New York. They needed the Americans to lend them the money to buy American goods. It was a circular flow. American investors would lend money to Britain. Britain would give that money to J.P. Morgan, and J.P. Morgan would give it back to American factories. In October 1915, J.P. Morgan organized the largest foreign loan in the history of Wall Street, the Anglo-French loan, $500 million. It was a staggering sum. The British and French delegations arrived in New York desperate for the money. They accepted an interest rate that was humiliatingly high. They effectively admitted that the credit of the British Empire was no longer infinite. But the loan was consumed in months. The war machine was burning $5 million a day in American purchases. By 1916, Britain was living hand to mouth. They were entirely dependent on the goodwill of American bankers and the tolerance of the American government. And this is where the geopolitical trap began to close. The President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, was officially neutral. He was running for re-election on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." Wilson was deeply suspicious of the bankers. He worried that if American banks lent too much money to the Allies, the United States would lose its neutrality. He worried that the American economy was becoming too dependent on the war trade. In late 1916, as the British were preparing to launch yet another massive bond sale in New York to keep themselves solvent, Woodrow Wilson decided to pull the rug out from under them. He was frustrated that the British were refusing his attempts to mediate a peace deal. He wanted to force the British to the negotiating table to end the war, and he knew he had the ultimate leverage: money. In November 1916, the U.S. Federal Reserve, acting with the approval of the White House, issued a warning to American banks and investors. It warned them against buying any more foreign treasury bills. It was a public vote of no confidence in British credit. The effect in London was catastrophic. The markets panicked. The British attempt to raise money collapsed. The flow of dollars stopped. In the cabinet war rooms in London, the British leaders stared into the abyss. It was November 1916. They had enough dollars left to pay for maybe a few weeks of supplies. After that, the guns would stop firing. The food would stop arriving. The empire would be bankrupt. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Reginald McKenna, wrote a terrifying memo to the Prime Minister. He stated plainly that by June 1917, the British government would be unable to meet its obligations. He warned that they would have to default. A default by Great Britain would destroy the global financial system. It would mean the end of the sterling as a reserve currency. It would mean the end of British power. Desperate, the British government took the final step in the dismantling of their financial dominance. They moved from voluntary sales of assets to mandatory confiscation. They passed laws forcing British subjects to surrender their foreign investments. The government seized billions of dollars worth of stocks and bonds and shipped them to New York, not to sell, but to use as collateral for emergency loans. They were pawning the empire. J.P. Morgan was working frantically in New York to keep the credit lines open, trying to convince American investors that Britain was still a safe bet. But the mood had turned. The Americans looked across the Atlantic and saw a stalemate in the trenches, and a government in London that was spending money like a drunken sailor. They began to demand hard assets, gold. The British Navy began to organize secret convoys of gold. Battleships and cruisers were loaded with bullion from the Bank of England and sent zigzagging across the U-boat-infested Atlantic. In one famous incident, the HMS Laurentic, carrying 43 tons of gold, hit a mine and sank off the coast of Ireland, sending millions of pounds to the bottom of the sea. But they couldn't stop shipping. They scraped the vaults. They pressured the French to send their gold. They pressured the Russians to send their gold. All of this gold ended up in one place, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The wealth of Europe was being physically transferred to the United States bar by bar. By the winter of 1916, Britain was facing a financial Dunkirk. They were completely cornered. They had sold their best assets. They had pawned their remaining ones. They had shipped their gold. And still the war raged on, consuming more and more. The British Prime Minister David Lloyd George later admitted that they were within weeks of a total financial collapse that would have forced a surrender not to the Germans, but to the creditors. The relationship between the two nations had fundamentally inverted. In 1914, the U.S. owed Britain money. By 1917, Britain was effectively a client state of the American banking system. The City of London had lost its autonomy. Every major decision about the war effort now had to be checked against the balance sheet in New York. This was the moment the British Empire truly died. It didn't die when India gained independence in 1947. It didn't die at Suez in 1956. It died in the winter of 1916 when the British government realized it could no longer pay for its own defense without American permission. The irony was bitter. Britain was fighting a war to preserve its status as a great power, but the very act of fighting that war was destroying the economic foundation of that power. They were winning the battles in Flanders, but losing the war in Wall Street. As 1917 dawned, the situation was critical. The Federal Reserve's warning was still in effect. The loans were drying up. The British Purchasing Commission in Washington was telling London that they couldn't sign any new contracts. There was simply no money. The British government knew that only one thing could save them. The United States government had to step in. Private banks like Morgan could no longer carry the load. The U.S. government itself had to start lending money to the Allies. But the U.S. government could only do that if it was a belligerent in the war. If the U.S. remained neutral, American laws forbade direct government loans to the Allies. So in the dark offices of Whitehall and the clubs of London, the British elite prayed for American entry into the war. Not just for the soldiers, but for the dollars. They knew that if America joined the fight, the U.S. Treasury would open its vaults. The financial restrictions would vanish. The Federal Reserve would support the loans. The fate of the British Empire now rested entirely on the decision of Woodrow Wilson. If he stayed neutral, Britain would go bankrupt and likely lose the war. If he joined the fight, Britain would be saved financially, but it would be forever indebted to the United States. It would be the junior partner. History remembers the Zimmerman telegram and the unrestricted submarine warfare as the reasons America entered the war, and those were the political triggers. But underneath the politics was the tectonic pressure of finance. American banks had lent billions to the Allies. American factories were completely dependent on Allied orders. If the Allies collapsed, the American economy would crash into a depression. The United States had effectively bought a stake in the Allied victory. The moment was approaching. The shooting war was stalemated in the mud of France, but the financial war had already been decided. The title of the world's financial superpower had already crossed the ocean. It was sitting in a vault in Lower Manhattan, waiting for the official handover ceremony. Britain had entered the war as the banker of the world. It was about to end it as the world's biggest beggar. The untold special relationship was about to be born, but it would not be a relationship of equals. It would be a relationship of debtor and creditor. And the bill for the salvation of 1917 would be paid in influence, power, and pride for the rest of the 20th century. The shooting was still going on, but the empire was already in foreclosure. On April 6, 1917, the United States Congress declared war on Germany. The isolationism was over. The sleeping giant had been poked awake by German U-boats and the clumsy diplomacy of the Zimmerman telegram. But while the newspapers' headlines screamed about soldiers and ships, the most significant shift happened in the quiet offices of the U.S. Treasury. The British government breathed a sigh of relief that was audible across the Atlantic. They had been weeks away from a sovereign default. Their credit was exhausted. Their gold reserves were gone. The entry of the United States wasn't just a military reinforcement, it was a financial rescue package. Almost immediately, the U.S. Congress passed the Liberty Loan Act. This allowed the U.S. government to sell bonds to its own citizens, the famous Liberty Bonds, and use that money to issue direct loans to the Allied governments. The scale of the lending was staggering. By the end of the war, the United States would lend over $10 billion to the Allies, equivalent to hundreds of billions today. Britain received the lion's share, about $4.3 billion, but this money wasn't a gift, it was a loan. And it came with strings attached that would fundamentally reshape the global order. The loans were commercial debts, they carried interest, and crucially, they were denominated in dollars. This meant that for decades to come, the British taxpayer would be working to pay back the American taxpayer. The wealth generated by British industry would be siphoned off to service the debt in New York. This financial dependency changed the relationship between London and Washington instantly. Before 1917, Britain was the senior partner, the world's policeman, the center of the global economy. After 1917, Britain was a client state. The British officials in Washington, men who were used to giving orders to the world, found themselves in the humiliating position of having to justify every purchase to American bureaucrats. They had to ask permission to buy wheat. They had to ask permission to buy steel. The U.S. Treasury scrutinized British spending to ensure that American dollars were not being used to prop up the British Empire as commercial interests at the expense of American business. Meanwhile, the war economy was cannibalizing Britain's future. To fight the war, British industries had stopped exporting. Textile mills in Lancashire stopped making cloth for India and started making uniforms for the army. Steel mills in Sheffield stopped making rails for Argentina and started making shell casings. This created a vacuum in the global market. And who stepped in to fill it? The United States and Japan. While Britain was busy fighting for its life, American and Japanese companies stole Britain's customers. They took over the markets in Latin America and Asia. They established relationships and supply chains that would last long after the war ended. When British factories finally switched back to peacetime production in 1919, they found that their old customers didn't need them anymore. They had lost their market share forever. The war ended on November 11th, 1918. Britain had won. The German High Seas fleet surrendered. The Kaiser abdicated. The British Empire reached its greatest territorial extent, absorbing German colonies in Africa and Ottoman territories in the Middle East. But it was a hollow victory. The financial autopsy of the war revealed a corpse. Britain had spent over $3.25 billion on the war effort, a sum that exceeded the total government expenditure for the previous 200 years combined. The national debt had exploded from $650 million in 1914 to $7.4 billion in 1919. More importantly, Britain had shifted from being the world's creditor to the world's debtor. Before the war, the world paid interest to London. After the war, London paid interest to New York. The flow of global capital had reversed. The City of London, the engine of British power, was crippled. The gold standard, the symbol of British financial stability, had been suspended. The pound sterling, once the unshakable bedrock of global trade, was now a volatile fiat currency floating against the dollar. In the 1920s, the British government tried desperately to turn back the clock. They were obsessed with restoring the pre-war order. They wanted to make London the financial capital of the world again. To do this, they believed they had to return to the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate of 4.86 to the pound. This decision, driven by pride and nostalgia, was an economic disaster. The British economy was too weak to support such a strong currency. By forcing the pound back to its old value, they made British exports incredibly expensive. This crushed British industry, leading to mass unemployment, the general strike of 1926, and a decade of stagnation known as the Lost Years. While the United States enjoyed the Roaring Twenties, fueled by the wealth transferred from Europe, Britain suffered. The special relationship became a euphemism for British dependency. The final bill for World War I wasn't just paid in the 1920s. It was a generational burden. The debt to the United States hung over the British economy for nearly a century. In a twist of irony, Britain was forced to default on its WWI debt to the U.S. in 1934 during the Great Depression because it simply couldn't pay. This default caused deep resentment in America and was one of the reasons why the U.S. Congress was so reluctant to lend money to Britain when World War II started in 1939. It led to the harsh cash and carry laws that forced Britain to liquidate its remaining assets all over again. The story of 1916-1917 is the prequel to the collapse of the British Empire. It was the moment the foundation cracked. The soldiers in the trenches of the Somme and Passchendaele believed they were fighting to preserve the empire. They fought with incredible courage and sacrifice. But they didn't know that the empire they were fighting for had already been mortgaged. They didn't know that the shells they were firing were paid for by selling the nation's future. They didn't know that the victory they won would bankrupt their children. The British Empire didn't end with a bang in 1947 or 1956. It ended in a quiet meeting room in New York in 1916 when a British diplomat had to admit to an American banker that the checkbook was empty. The handover of global power from Britain to the United States was not a violent revolution. It was a hostile takeover masked as a rescue. It was a transaction, and the price of the transaction was the British Empire itself. This concludes the story of how WWI bankrupted Britain. It is a reminder that, in the modern world, financial sovereignty is the only sovereignty that matters. You cannot be a superpower if you are living on an overdraft. And you cannot rule the waves if you have to borrow the money to buy the ships. I'm John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.